Hello students, today we are going to discuss about communication. Introduction. Communication is the act of conveying information for the purpose of creating a shared understanding. It is something that humans do every day. In other words, communication is the activity of conveying information through exchange of thoughts, messages or information as by speech, visuals, signals, writing, or behavior. The term communication has been derived from Latin communis, which means common. In a layman's term, communication is the sharing of information. It is the giving and receiving of messages. Communication requires a sender, a message, and recipient. The communication process is complete once the receiver has understood the message from the sender. It also means a meaningful exchange of information between two or a group of people. Communicative competence designates the capability to install intersubjective interactions, which means that communication is an inherent social interaction. Let's now discuss some definitions of communication. Communication is a two-way process that results in a shared meaning or common understanding between the sender and the receiver. The following definitions will underscore the fact that unless a common understanding results from the exchange of information, there is no communication. Brucker, 1949, says, communication is anything that conveys meaning, which carries a message from one person to another. Hovland, 1964, says, communication is a process by which an individual, the communicator, transmits, usually verbal symbols, to modify the behavior of another individuals, that is, receiver. Solomon, 1981, states that communication in its wider sense is a process whereby people convey knowledge, influence each other, and create and maintain a basis of shared notions. Keaton, 2011, says, communication can be defined as a process of transmitting information and common understanding from one person to another. Now coming to the characteristics of communications. Harold Raswell described a communication system as who, say what, in which channel, to whom, with what effect. Now to understand this better, here are some of the characteristics of communication. Number 1. Communication is a bipolar process. One person speaks or writes and the other person listens or read. Number 2. It is also a psychological process as emotions are also made understood by communication along with ideas and facts. Number 3. Communication is the purposeful process that involves sources, messages, channels, and receivers. Number 4. Communication occurs everywhere intentionally or unintentionally. Number 5. Communication is a continuous and comprehensive process. This means that speaking, listening, and understanding, all these three activities go together. If any of these activities stops, then communication will stand still. Number 6. Communication involves interaction, the give and take that provides feedback to persons involved in exchanging ideas. Number 7. Communication is an instinctive process, so no prior assessment of the process is possible. Number 8. Communication can be written, oral, and symbolic. Immediate feedback is possible in case of oral communication. Now we have various types of communication. Communication can be broadly classified into two types. One is verbal communication and number 2, non-verbal communication. Let's discuss them in detail. Verbal communication. Verbal communication may be written, oral, intrapersonal, interpersonal, and public communication. Written communication. In written communication, words are the most important means of communication. Words are not only used to express facts, thoughts, and ideas, but also attitudes, feelings, and emotions towards people, objects, and events. Written communication refers to messages that are expressed on paper through words or pictures such as graphs, diagrams, models, etc. Written communication does not provide the benefits of immediate feedback and it tends to be expensive and time-consuming. Now coming to oral communication. Oral communication may be through face-to-face interchange or over telephone, etc. Its main advantage is that it provides feedback and creates a personal touch among the persons. It helps in making communication more effective and it promotes better understanding of ideas and intentions. Intrapersonal communication. Intrapersonal communication refers to communication with oneself. The communication is within the self and to the self. Example, thinking, working out a problem, writing diaries, and hearing one speak. Intrapersonal communication continues as long as a person is alive. Interpersonal communication. Interpersonal communication means communication between at least few people who interact face-to-face, like a telephonic conversation interview, talking to friends, etc. Public communication. Public communication takes place in situations where many people receive messages largely from one source. Now coming to non-verbal communication. In this type of communication, instead of using words, only symbols are used. The receiver of the message necessarily knows these symbols, so he reacts to them at proper time. Number 1. Raising hand by the teacher to instruct the students to keep quiet and sign language, etc. are few examples of non-verbal communication. Non-verbal communication describes the process of conveying meaning in the form of non-word messages. Some forms of non-verbal communication includes gesture, body language and posture, facial expression and eye contact, object communication such as clothing, hairstyle, architecture, symbols, tone of voice, as well as aggregate of all the above. Speech also contains non-verbal elements known as paralanguage. These include voice quality, emotion, and speaking style, as well as prosodic features such as rhythm, intonation, and stress. Likewise, written texts include non-verbal elements such as handwriting style, spatial arrangements of words, and the use of emoticons to convey emotional expression in pictorial form. Let's now discuss the elements of communication cycle. The communication cycle is a process by which a message is sent by one individual and it passes through a chain of recipients. The timing and effectiveness of a communication cycle is based on how long it takes for feedback to be received by the initial sender. Understanding the educational process depends upon understanding the communication process. Communication is a complex concept that requires considerable reflection as to its nature and mode of transmission. The basic communication model consists of 5 elements of communication. Number 1, sender or source. This is technically called encoder. It is a person who sends the message. Number 2, the receiver. It is a person who interprets a message sent by a source. A receiver can be one person or an entire audience of people. Number 3, the message. These are set of verbal or non-verbal cues sent by the source or sender. Messages can be written or spoken, gestures, movements, etc. The message may be the most crucial element of effective communication. Number 4, the channel. It is the means or medium used to convey the stimuli. The message travels from one point to another via a channel of communication. The channel sits between the sender and the receiver. And number 5, feedback. It is the last element of effective communication and describes the receiver's response or reactions to the sender's message. Feedback helps the sender to determine how the receiver interpreted the message and how it can be improved. In communication process, a sender (encoder) encodes a message and then using a medium (channel) sends it to the receiver, that is decoder, who decodes the message and after processing the information sends back appropriate feedback (reply) using a medium or channel. Now coming to barriers in communication. Most people will agree that communication between two individuals should be simple. When you communicate, you are successful in getting your point across to the person you're talking to. It is important to remember that there are differences between talking and communicating. When we talk, we tend to erect barriers that hinder our ability to communicate. Some of the communication barriers during conversation includes semantic barrier. Such barriers are created due to language-related mistakes. Presentation barrier. This barrier arises if there is any fault in the organizational structure of the message. Personal barrier. These barriers are specially related to either sender or receiver and miscommunication is created. Emotional barrier. Emotional state at a particular point of time also affects communication. That is, mood of the sender at the time of sending the message and mood of the receiver at the time of receiving the message. Physical barrier. These barriers are related to physical conditions and environment of the sender and the receiver. Organizational complexity barrier. Greater the hierarchy in an organization, that is, more the number of managerial levels, more is a chance of communication getting destroyed. So how do we communicate effectively? Let's see some of those. Communication skills are the set of skills that enable a person to convey information so that it is received and understood. It is essential to know the following ways in order to have effective communication. It is important to know the who, what, why, when, and how of communication. It means whom you are communicating with, what are you communicating, what the goal of your communication is, that means what you want to achieve, when you will communicate the issue, and how you will communicate the issue. Now, coming to classroom communication. Basically, the process of education consists of a transaction between teacher and student. Teaching may be considered as a sort of communication. The teacher is supposed to communicate new ideas, attitudes, information, behavior, skills, etc. Teachers' communication will be fruitful only when students receive and understand it and learn it. Here, the teachers are senders of communication and students are the receivers. Mere presentation of message or a lesson by the teacher is communication, but it cannot be effective unless it leads to true learning. Good teaching is more than communication. It is not merely enough for the students to merely repeat the same word as conveyed. The students should be able to make a permanent and meaningful addition to the students' own communication skills. Classroom communication is not mere one-sided presentation of facts. It requires intercommunication between student and teacher. There needs to be interaction with constant reciprocal feedback. Classroom communication exists in 3 categories: verbal, non-verbal, and written. Verbal communication means anything that a teacher or student speaks aloud. Non-verbal communication refers to body language that people express. Written communication refers to directed at a specific audience, such as report card comments or student assignments. Teachers and students interact with one another in many different contexts and use all 3 of these types of communication. Since communication is an interactive process, it is very close to teaching. Success of teaching lies in the success of communication. Some of the factors that can lead to effective classroom communication are: number 1, using of best teaching strategies. Number 2, using proper technology. Number 3, effective use of feedback. Number 4, effective two-way communication. Number 5, development of motivation. Number 6, principle of clarity. Coming to the conclusion. In today's globalized, media-driven world, communication studies have become more relevant and exciting than ever. Students who earn degrees in communication often hold highly influential positions as journalists, editors, university professors, public relation officers, marketing consultants, speech writers, filmmakers, motivational speakers, and political campaign managers. To communicate is to shape the world. So, communication is a process of social interaction where 2 or more individuals interact. They try to tangibly influence the ideas, attitudes, knowledge, and behavior of each other. Communication is thus an exchange of information, knowledge, ideas, or feelings taking place between 2 individuals. But in a face-to-face situation, the gestures, expressions, language, and tone create an impact on communication. Thus, in conclusion, we can say that communication is a process of sharing information, thoughts, and feelings between people through speaking, writing, or body language, and this will lead to effective communication. Thank you.